on morphology, ferns, gymnosperms, and monocots. So I was asked to give kind of a basic plant identification course. And so this starts from the basics. So we've got compound leaves versus simple leaves. So we've got leaflets here. So these are leaflets, and we know it's a leaflet because there's a bud at the base, right? As opposed to one leaf and a bud at the base, okay? When you've got compound leaves, there's kind of three options. They can be palmate, like your palm. So palmate, just like a palm, or they could be pinnate. And then pinnate can be evenly. My screen, I don't want to touch it because it's the Zoom stuff, but so oddly doesn't have one at the tip, and then, or does have one at the tip, and then evenly doesn't. And then if there's only three of them, then you just call it trifoliate, right? But it's just kind of, in a sense, a pinnate. And then you could be pinnate of a pinnate, so it could be doubly pinnate. And if you're a fern, you could be triply pinnate. Again, we know that these are leaves because of the buds at the base, right? So there's buds at the base, so we know that those are leaves, which is usually super easy for woody plants. Not necessarily the easiest thing the first couple of weeks of spring, but once you get, past mid-May, it's usually pretty easy. Then if we're looking at our leaf, we've got, parallel veins. Usually we think of monocots, or branched, and branched can either be kind of a palmate branched, again, like a palm, or they can be this pinnate again. So it's the same term with kind of the straight line and then the stuff coming off the sides. If we're looking at our leaf edges, they could be entire, so just totally smooth around the edge, or they could be lobed. So there could be, I've just got two examples of lobes. This one's an easy one. Anyone know it? You can't answer, but I'll give you a second. Sassafras, right? And then we've got lobed. This would be an oak, probably a white oak. Okay. And then you could have some kind of tooth. And the most common tooth is serrate. There's a whole bunch of terms for different tooth, but tooth is good enough. Then with our leaf shape, you could be all different kinds of shapes. I just picked a couple of the simplest ones. So kind of your typical oval, they could be kind of roundish. The most typical is kind of more like this, maybe lance-like, it's where it's a little bigger at the base. And then they could be lobed. We just did this, so pinnately lobed or palmately lobed. And then where the leaf attaches, or where the petiole attaches, it can have a weird attachment. So if it's kind of heart-shaped, we call it cordate. If it's pointier, sagittate or arrow-shaped. A weird one where it goes all the way through it or wraps all the way around, perfilate. And then peltate's one of my favorites. They look kind of like umbrellas. And then unusual, usually they're symmetrical. So usually it'd be the same on both sides. If it's not symmetrical, then you call it oblique. Okay. If we're doing our arrangements, there's just two kind of basic. You can have all the leaves come from the base. Think of a dandelion. So those would be basal. Or they could come off the stem, so cauline or on the stem. And if they're coming off the stem, then you've got really two choices. They could be opposite, so two leaves coming from the same point. A modified opposite would be actually three leaves coming from the same point, or 5 or 6 or 10 or whatever. That's world and opposite are basically the same. And then alternate, and so they alternate back and forth. Okay. Again, starting from ground zero, we'll get going fast in a minute. Then we've got our flower parts. We've got, the pistil, the female part. So we've got stigma style ovary. The seeds, the ovules are in the ovary. The stigma is sticky, is how I always remember it, and that's collectively the pistil. We've got our stamen, the male parts. So there's the long stalk, the filament, and then where the pollen actually comes out of the anther. Then we've got petals. Usually I think of petals as pretty. All the petals collectively is the corolla. You don't usually use corolla unless you're talking about petals that are fused, but technically just all the petals are the corolla. Again, you usually only use the term when they're fused in some way. And then sepals are the last one. Usually those are green, they don't have to be. And again, all those collectively is the calyx. The petals and sepals together, perianth. Okay. These make up the four whorls. So if you've got all four whorls, and they all come, excuse me, they all come from the same point. So you can see these are coming from the same point. So all the anthers come from the same point. All the pistils come from the same point. All the petals come from the same point. All the sepals come from the same point. So they make up the four whorls. If you've got all four whorls, it's a perfect flower by definition. If we're looking at the pistil could be made up of different parts. So sometimes carpel and pistil is used a little bit interchangeably, depending on who it is. So if you, in this case, if you cut this pistil here, this pistil's got different sections to it, and that's your, your sections of an orange. They don't have to be all fused together like that. They could be fused in all different ways because just depending on how they've evolved. You don't need to know any of these terms. They're not used very much, but the idea is they could be not fused at all. So in this case, the pistils and the carpels are basically the same thing. That's really common for like, we'll do Ranunculaceae on, or for that matter, today we'll do Alistomyceae. They typically have carpels that are unfused, lots of them. But they could be fused in all different ways, okay? If we're talking about the inflorescence is just all of the flowers, kind of a collective term for all the flowers on the plant. So there could be just one solitary, right? They could all be directly on the stem. So that's a spike. They could have their own little tiny stem, and that's a raceme. If the little stem is branched, then it doesn't become a little stem anymore. Usually it's pretty big. That's a panicle. Most of your grasses are panicles. Then we've got an umbel. They all start at one point and they kind of come to one point, or the umbel could also just be that they're all basically the same size. So they don't have to come to the same point, but they're basically all they start from the same point and they're more or less the same size. Umbel. Corm. Looks like a fake umbel, but they're starting from different points. Okay. Umbel's real common in Apiaceae. We'll do that on Wednesday. Corm, super common in viburnums. We'll do that on Wednesday. And then a head, usually we just think of Asteraceae for that, dandelions, that kind of stuff. And then a unique spike that's got this leaf that kind of protects it is the spathe and spadex. We only see that with Araceae. That'll be one of our families we do today. And then another unique spike that just kind of droops, we call a catkin. Okay, so the spathe and spadex and the catkin are really just modified spikes. So they're all the same thing. Botanists love terms. If there's a weird shape, we give it a new term. Okay. Growth forms. This is aquatic plants. So, I mean, we're a bunch of wetland people. So they could be submerged underwater. Those are typically limp out of water. And then they could be floating, right? Most people don't talk about these two because only aquatic people talk about that. And there aren't that many aquatic plants. So usually people just go right to these. So your typical terrestrial or an aquatic plant that sticks up, we call it an emergent. And they could be woody, obviously it has wood, or non-woody, which doesn't have wood, which we also call herbaceous, or you could be more pretentious and say herbaceous without the H. Herbaceous, same word, just depending on how you pronounce it. Woodies, the shorter ones are shrubs. Technically, there isn't a good definition for shrub or tree. They're shorter in parentheses. And they have multiple stems, usually, whereas a tree would be taller and have lots of stems. Depending on who you are, you'd argue what's a small tree or a big shrub. Different authors have different opinions. Generally more than 10 feet's a tree, but you could get in arguments. And then non-woody or herbaceous are grass-like or graminoids, and then non-graminoids or forbs. Okay. Then we've got our different our phylogenetic groups. So we've got mosses, our true plants. We're not going to do mosses today. They're their own discipline, they're their own terminology. Bryologist, I do Arctic stuff, so bryologists are a big deal because mosses are, but it's its own field. Lichen also, lichenologist, bryologist, lichenologist, again, really common in the Arctic. We're not going to do those today. So we're just going to do vascular plants. So ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms all have vascular tissue. Gymnosperms and then angiosperms have seeds. So gymnosperms don't have flowers, so they just have these cones, but they have perfectly good seeds. And then monocots and dicots are flowering plants that have flowers and fruits. And then we could talk about monocots, one cotyledon versus dicots, two cotyledons. And then monocots tend to be in flower parts in trees. So you got 3 petals here, 3 stamen. Oftentimes the pistils broke into 3s as well. They've got a blade or blade and sheath, okay, versus a blade and petiole for your flowering or for your dicots. And then the branched veins, okay, versus parallel veins, and then a tap root, a big root, versus all about the same fibrous roots. Okay, those aren't always, but they're usually. All right, so that was our 15-20 minute just intro. So now what you came for, the family characteristics. So here's my legal disclaimer. These are I just picked some random families. They aren't random. I picked the families that I thought, well, these are the ones I teach in my class. And I teach them because, one, they're either easy, like really easy. So you feel good because you actually recognize that family, or because they're like really important for wetlands. Okay, I tend to go easy, but there's a couple of them that, well, I'd feel like a failure if I didn't do it because they're important in wetlands. And then the characteristics I go over don't apply to every member of the family, right? There'll be some that don't do that. But if you find the characteristic we go over, then it's very likely a member of that family, okay? So we're just gonna start out with ferns. And I'm actually only gonna do one family, and it's not even a fern, it's a fern ally. But there's some really basic fern terms. So again, I thought that this handout would be kind of an easy reference if you're keying stuff out, trying to use all the terms, all the basic terms in a really simple way. So we start anywhere here. Rhizome. So ferns are actually like little trees in a sense that where all the stem is underground. So technically this is a stem that's underground, hence a rhizome. And then all the leaves, they're not really, they're kind of stem-like and leaf-like, so we call them fronds. Leaves are really just modified stems, so you know they're just even more modified. So ferns are a little bit more stemmy, if you will. So we just say frond. Okay, frond, leaf, same thing. And then so you can talk about the blade of the frond versus the petiole, or again, botanists love terms, so you'd say stipe. And what's really fun is basically every fern does that little fiddlehead thing. So fiddlehead or crosier is how they unwind, if you will. And then what you absolutely need if you're going to identify a fern is the little spore producing structures, sori. We'll do that more in a second. The leaves are oftentimes really dissected. So you could have a simple leaf. That's rare. There's hardly any of those. They could be really deeply lobed. They don't just say lobed, pinnifed or pentafed. I don't say all these terms properly. And then the more common is they'd be pinnate or doubly pinnate or triply pinnate. Okay. I mix these up some of the time, so sometimes I have to look at these. The pinnae are the first. So this is, right off the main stem. Like, of course, they can't say just main stem, it's a rachis. Okay. So the pinnae are the ones coming right off the rachis. So this whole thing is a pinnae. Okay. And then if the pinnae has pinnae on it, if you will, then you'd call it a pinnule. Okay. So this is a pinnule, this is a pinnule, this is a pinnule. You get the idea. Okay. Which is important if you're keying these out because, you don't want to do the wrong thing. If you're keying out a fern, you pretty much need sori. And so you have to look around for sori. And here's just some fun pictures of sori. So it could be kind of, this is like this, what is stag fern. It's at Meyer Gardens, kind of fun. And so like the whole leaf is covered in these little dots, which are the sori. Most people think of just little dots on leaves, and that's pretty common. They could be cool. They could be little dots that are only around the edge of the leaf. That's a kind of neat pattern. They could be stripes. They could be only on some of the parts, right? So this would be like the interrupted fern, common wetland fern that's super common around here. Or they could be a sterile frond and a fertile frond. So this is your sensitive fern, which is another super common wetland plant. So if it's going to produce spores, it's a totally different frond. Okay. So you have to look around for it. If you're really getting good, I didn't bring my little loop, but usually I got one in my office, but it's sitting at home on my dresser. So you need a little magnifying glass. You'd look at the indusium, and then the shape of each one of these. So again, each one of these will open up and produce spores. And so sori is like all of them. Sorus would be like one of them. And then each one of these little circles is a sporangium, which is a generic term for the little structure that produces spores. They've got some little stalk that they're on, and that's your indusium. And that little stalk can be all different shapes. And so they get a different term for all these different shapes. Of course, I'm not an expert in ferns, but I know to look for indusium, and then I just get out my key and go from there. So again, a nice reference to look. And then you could have no indusium. So these are just naked sori, right? Blasphemous. So it's just a bunch of sori. All right, we're only doing one fern or one fern family. So this is our one fern, Equisetum acaea. All families in an ACA, and this one's super easy. I give it a little thumbs up because you can't miss this one. If you know what you're looking for, it's these little segments. It's super easy because it's so segmented. So they're really rough. They've actually got sand in them, so it makes them a good scrubber for like if you go camping. They've got the little cone-like stromboli or strombolus, which produces all the spores. And then if you actually looked at the spores under the scope, they've actually got these little elaters, which is kind of the neat thing. So this is one spore and it's got this little thing on it. Kind of cool. What's really funny is a lot of ferns hybridize. If you got big spores, it's probably a hybrid. It's not always the case, but oftentimes the case. All right, if you're keying these out, you're going to have to look real close at these little teeth here at each section. And you'll probably have to do a cross section of some of these. And then you'll probably have to look at, well, you know, some of these branch and some of them don't. Okay. Now, for every one of these families, so this one's easy because there's just the one genus. So Equisetum, Equisetum ACA, same genus, family, same thing. Now, this is what I was talking about, the cross section. So here's two common ones. They look about the same. These little teeth at each section look pretty similar to me. Hard for me to tell the difference. But if you cut it, then you'd see the totally open versus not. Okay, so oftentimes you'd have to cut these to identify them. Now, for all these families, I'm going to just show, this is just from the U of M herbarium. They've got a phenomenal website that you should all be super familiar with. And so I'm just going to show you a plant list for each of these families. So here's our list. This is only the facultative or obligate wetland plants. So here's that wetlands. So here, from this list, I'm just going to show a bunch of these lists. So there's the coefficient of conservation. So like a asterisk is non-native, 0 is no value, 10 is high value. So like these ones are high value, but it's actually, oh, we'll get to it. And then our wetland indicator status. So whether it's facultative wetland or obligate wetland, then what it is, these ones are all ferns, or actually fern allies. And then there might be a status here. So like this one was actually, it's not found in Michigan anymore. It's gone locally extinct. Okay. And then I'll just show something about, because we're talking about families. What's really nice about aquatic plants is there's fewer of them. So I love teaching aquatic plants because it's doable. We can go to a pond or a wet area, and like if I take a field trip there, by the end of the field trip, there's probably maybe 10 to maybe at most 30 plants that are really common there. So you can actually learn almost all of them. So it's great to learn your wetland plants and then apply that to upland. So I'll just provide a little bit of upland stuff just to kind of give you a feel. That was it for ferns. There are a lot of other ferns, but the only like easy characteristic family is Equisetum, in my opinion. So now we're doing gymnosperms, and again, we're only doing one family, pine ACA. And there's one easy characteristic, they've got the needle-like leaves. It's pretty diverse though. They're mostly evergreen, but not all. And they're all woody. Mostly, well, I'll show you the trees. So there's only two that are in wetlands. So the Larix leucinia and then the Picea, the black spruce. Okay, but there's lots of non-wetland ones. So I always do these ones just because we're in Michigan, and it's usually I teach this in the fall, and it makes people feel good to be able to identify stuff all winter. So pines, again, there are no wetland pines in Michigan, but here's the handful of species. Pines are really easy because it's the only one with multiple needles. If you got 5 needles, it's the white pine. If it's 2, then we've got, some others. Spruce are pretty simple because the needles are kind of squarish and they're real pokey. Pines are also pokey. You should be able to roll them between your fingers, but they're kind of angled. Makes them fairly easy. Firs, there's only the one native, and it's got flat needles. They're generally pretty soft. So they're like good Christmas trees because you don't poke yourself when you're putting ornaments on. Or bad if you've got little kids, they're always messing with their ornaments, right? You want them to poke them. keep their hands off. There is a Douglas fir, which is kind of naturalized, that looks very, very similar, but it's really easy because of the cones. It's got these rat tails or tridents. So it's the seeds have this, looks like a rat's butt. Douglas fir. And then hemlock, suga. They're also flat, but they're really tiny. And they're cute. And they got little tiny cones. And then the wetland one, Larix. So you'd find these in bogs around here, and they look like maybe bicycle spokes with all the needles coming out. And this one's fun because it's deciduous. So it'd make a horrible Christmas tree. It loses all its needles. And it's kind of soft, kind of fun. All right, so that was it for Gymnosperms. We're going to go right to Monocots. So Monocots, we've got Monocots are really common in wetlands. They do well in wetlands because they've got the parallel veins, and the parallel veins kind of help get air down to their roots, parenchyma. So monocots tend to be really good in wet areas. So in dry areas, monocots are typically rarer, except for grasses. But in wet areas, they tend to be the dominant plants. So we're just going to go through a handful of families here. Hollister, sometimes said Alyssinaceae. All right, this one's a fun one because it's all aquatic, and then it's got these basal leaves. The easy characteristic form is they've got tons of carpels. It's kind of hard to tell from this picture, but all these carpels are unfused. Lots of stamen. You can tell easily from this where it's a little more mature. So, and then this, you could potentially confuse it with a ranunculus, Ranunculaceae, but you wouldn't because this is a monocot and ranunculus is dicot. So it's got these really good parallel veins. And it's going to form either a raceme, so Sagittaria, or a panicle, so a branched for Alyssima. So these are the only two in Michigan. So again, here's our list. We've got Alyssima, and then Sagittaria are pretty much the two common ones. So I've got a better picture of these. Sagittaria is really easy because it's got sagittate leaves, hence the name. So real pointy. Kind of lost the point at the end. So they look like arrow shaped. There is a Sagittaria that doesn't have that. So if you just cut that off, you'll actually see the veins are pretty unique, and they look pretty similar for both of them, right? So so they're kind of these unique veins. But Sagittaria is really easy set. Sagittate leaves, but then it's also got what I think of as the Spider-Man symbol for the veins. Okay, so that makes it really easy. There's also there's several other monocots that have very, very similar leaves, but they don't have the Spider-Man symbol. And then Alyssima is a branched. This is actually a small inflorescence for this. They can be huge. So that makes them pretty easy later in the season. I should have done a close-up of the flower, but the flowers would have lots of these little unfused pistils or unfused carpels. So there's Alyssima. Araceae. In my mind, Araceae is the easiest family. It's Spathe and Spadex. So Spathe, Spadex. Spathe, Spadex. Huge spade, little Spadex. Jack in the Pulpit, a lot of people's favorites, Spathe and Spadex. Here's Peltandra, which looks almost identical to Sagittaria, which we just saw. Peltandra is easy because there's a vein that goes all the way around it. So it looks like a kid traced it. So that's totally different venation. But it's got a Spathe and Spadex, Okay. That makes them super, super, super easy. Jack in the Pulpit is the only Araceae that isn't a wetland plant. Araceae is super common in the tropics. So if you go to greenhouses, there's always some fun Araceae. And you can sound really intelligent because you say, oh yeah, that's Araceae. Even though you have no clue what the heck it is. But Spathe and Spadex. So here's our list again. And what's kind of annoying is the Michigan flora added another family to Araceae. People argue about this, which is the duckweeds. Okay, so I've crossed out Laminaceae here because I think that is a good family. That's the old name according to the Michigan flora, but if you grab a different book published, you know, in the last couple of years, they might keep this as its own family. These ones are easy though. They're your duckweeds, right? So I've got the four main duckweeds. So Spirodella is really easy because it's got multiple roots per frond. Again, we're using the term frond because it's kind of leaf-like, kind of stem-like. Whereas Lemna minor only, or Lemnas in general, only have one. So there's three roots here, but that's because there's three fronds. So this one's got two because there's two fronds. If I did another one with four, right, then I would have four roots, right? One per frond. Lemna trisulca is easy, it floats below the surface. And then Wolfias is tiny. Your typical like 12-point font, this would be an O for a typical 12-point font. So it's blown up and then you get your little tiny plant inside. It's the smallest flowering plant on the plant. So these technically fit within Araceae, according to some authors, which happens to be the Flora for Michigan, which is the easy one that's free online. So what I use and what you probably should use. So you just kind of remember Araceae also includes the duckweeds. Because your typical Araceae doesn't look anything like a duckweed. So your corpse flower, again, phenomenal Spadex, right? Your peace lily, right? The Spadex. Super easy family. All right. So that was an easy one. Now this one's just annoying. Hydrocarda ACA. I don't see any pattern here personally. I mean, the flowers are technically, but for your typical, these are all aquatic and it's pretty diverse morphology. That's why I gave it this kind of frown face. The flowers are the same, but almost all your submergents, you'll never see a flower, right? So, you know, it's not very helpful if you don't have a flower. So here's your list. They're all obligate wetland plants. They're all submergents. Well, this one floats, but they're all definitely in the water. And so I'll just go over the three biggies. So Elodea is probably the most common, and it's super easy. It's just whorls of three. Okay, so remember, whorl is when more than two leaves come from the same point, and they're good monocot. So we've got parallel veins. Elodea is your it's the fun one that you'd look at in Bio 101 where you're looking at cells, because it's really thin and you can look at it under a microscope without cutting it or anything, and you can actually look through because there's only several cell layers thick. It's kind of fun. So that makes it easy. Parallel, whorls of three, simple. Valsnaria is a fun one. It looks maybe like the head of lettuce, right? Because it's all coming from one point. It's got these really long leaves. These leaves can be 5 foot. They can, or they could be tiny. What's neat is if you look at the leaves, you do and this you might have to look a little bit, but this picture is great. You can see the three different zones. So there's kind of the three zones. And then there's some sideways veins that look like broken glass to me. So that makes it really easy. The three zones is sometimes hard to see. The broken glass is never hard to see. This center area is actually, it's got airspace in it. That's arenchyma. That's it's the plant tissue that's got open space or lacunae, open space that allow oxygen to get to the roots. The main reason why, what makes aquatic plants, we'll just digress for a second here, humor biology professor, what makes them aquatic plants is they've got some adaptation to live underwater. That's the name, right? And underwater is not really a big deal because plants like water, right? They need it to do photosynthesis. But what happens is the soils become anoxic. So the issue is not in the water, it's the anoxic soils. So they've got some adaptation to get either oxygen to the roots, hence arenchyma, or they can tolerate it in some way. Another fun thing about Vallisneria, it's got this little corkscrew, like that's the inflorescence, that's the flower, it's the stalk for the flower. The flower actually, pretty sure, I think all the flowers in Michigan for all your submergents are on the surface. So they don't really underwater. And if they do underwater, they'll open up the underwater and then they float up to the top and then they float around. So Vallisneria is one of those fun ones where they've the pollen looks like little sailboats and they float around, they float over to the other one. It's kind of fun. All right, so that's Vallisneria. And then Najas. Najas is these whorls again. So whorls, they're much smaller leaves, and they've got little teeth on them. You need a hand lens to really see that, but they've got these little spiny leaves. Another good characteristic for Najas is everywhere that there's a whorl of leaves, there's a stalk. Okay, so basically anywhere there's a leaf, there's a stalk, with the exception of like the newest leaves. It takes them a little bit to make a stalk. Now, that's really not unique to Najas. Every plant on the planet, stems come from where a leaf was, but Najas really does it. So almost every time that there's a set of leaves, it'll actually make a stem. So it ends up looking really bushy. Anyhow, like I said, this family, I just memorized what genera are in it, because there aren't, like, unless you're looking at the flower, which are pretty rare, there's not a good characteristic. Like Araceae, it was super easy to remember the Spathis spadix. All right, next. Liliaceae. Liliaceae are easy because there's 3 petals, okay, and 3 sepals. Now, they look the same, right? How do I know this is a sepal? So I give that an S versus a P, because, normally I think of petals as pretty, right? These look the same. So a lot of times people won't say 3 petals and 3 sepals, they'll say 6 tepals because they look the same. But we know they're petals because of where they come from. Remember your whorls. So the petals all come from the same point. You can see that these sepals are coming from behind. So that's how we know that they're sepals. It's just where they come from. So if you've got 6 tepals, it's typical monocot, but lilies they're really simple. They've almost always got 6 stamens, 1 stamen for each of these tepals. And then the pistil here has got 3 parts to it. And it's usually pretty straightforward. And they're cute little flowers. Almost all your bulbs, a couple weeks ago, in early May, late April, almost all those are Liliaceae. Historically Liliaceae. What's really annoying is they've split this family up. It's sad because this is a good characteristic for the family, but now you're going to have to remember, well, it's a good characteristic for these families. So these are the only ones that are in wetlands though. So there's lots of species. So you see, I merged these. So these are our wetland ones. These are the only two that are wetland, and I just listed both of them in the family. But there's lots of others that are upland, and then each of the different families. Okay, so I just got a couple of fun pictures that they're pretty distinct looking. So trout lily, a lot of you guys know trout lily because it's just finishing now. Like the leaves are actually starting to wither, but it looks like trout, and it's a common understory. Pretty, you could find some white ones, but they're almost all yellow. But you can easily see 3 petals, 3 sepals, 6 stamen, great liliaceae. Your garlic and onions and leeks, and again, these are kind of closely related families, depending on who it is, how much they split it. All good lilies, liliaceae. So it's a fun one. Liliaceae in general, you're not supposed to put in your worm ranch. Okay, worms don't like them. All right, so that was liliaceae. Orchidaceae. Orchids, obviously don't pick orchids. Orchids are super unique flowers. Okay, so we've got good monocot again, so parallel veins, right? But super like specialized flowers. And I'll go all over these parts in just a second. But just to point out, there's like, you can't even read this. It's too small, right? These are all wetland ones, right? So there's lots of orchids, but if you look, they're all like super high numbers. So they're rare. You're only going to find these in like pristine environments. There is one weedy orchid, and with Hella something. And I had it in my yard the last 2 summers, and I kept it because it's an orchid, even though it's a weed, invasive weed. But most of these are like super rare stuff. And then there's lots of other species that are in upland as well. So here's the characteristics for them. You guys probably already know orchids. Orchid's kind of its own like group of super duper plant, if you will, that there's oftentimes orchid events. You know, I went to Michigan State, and Michigan State had the annual orchid show, and you go around and look at all the orchids. People that like collect orchids are pretty intense about it. So like if you study orchids, you're not allowed to like tell people where you got them from, because someone else will go dig them up. It's kind of sad. You know, you'll talk to a fellow botanist and they'll be real squeamish about telling you where this orchid is, because they're afraid someone's going to go pick it, because these orchid people will go pick it, and then they'll destroy all the other ones. So then they've got the only one. It's kind of sad. All right. So orchid, it's got this one petal is really big, oftentimes the lip/labellum. Okay. And then so here's another lip labellum. So really specialized. And then the column is weird. It's the stamen and the pistil kind of fused together. It's hard to tell in this picture, but that's yellow. So that's the anther. And so the stamen and the pistil are all kind of fused together. If I just go back to this one, you could see, so that there's a column there, and then there's the anther. And these are in such weird configurations that, you know, your insects got to like crawl in there and then they get pollinated. So they tend to be a very obligate pollinator. So only like one insect can fit in there and pollinate it. And that's why there's so many species. So again, there's the lip labellum. And then we've got our petals. Remember, you know that those are petals because of where they come from. Be easier with a plant that you could hold and tear apart. Although no one's going to be happy if you go tearing apart an orchid, right? And then sepals again come from behind. So just got a couple of fun pictures of some orchids. lady slippers are pretty common. Lots of people know, and it looks kind of like a slipper, right? Good monocot, parallel veins. Saugatuck Dunes has some great lady slippers. I haven't been there recently, but this time of year, they're always, well, another week or two from now, they're always in flower. Next family, Pontederiaceae. Another fun thing, a lot of your aquatic plants are really specialized. So, and depending on how specialized something looks, it gets its own family, right? So most of your aquatic plants only have a handful of genera within the family because they're so kind of unique. These are all terrestrial plants that then went back to the water. So so if you just kind of take the genus name and add an ACA to the end, you're right, like more than half the time for an aquatic plant. So Pontederia, and here's Pontederiaceae, here's Pontederia, right? These ones, again, they're all aquatic. They're kind of lily-like flowers, but they're a lot smaller, right? And they've usually got these really spongy stems. There's really only 3 here in Michigan. This one isn't really in Michigan. This is sometimes it'll escape, but that's a tropical or subtropical plant. So again, this is subtropical, so it shouldn't be here. So there's really just the 2 species, but they're cool and they're easy. So here's the 2 species. So here's Pontederia, what the family is named after. And look, all the veins kind of flow from one point. It's really cool. It looks like someone poured paint that they didn't mix quite properly. So it's all these veins flowing from one point. And it's kind of heart-shaped, or so a lot of people will see Pontederia, Peltandra, Sagittaria. The venation is quite different from them. And I've shown you all 3 of those. Sagittaria had the Spider-Man logo. Peltandra had the kid traced it, and then Pontederia, they all flow from one point. And those are, all 3 of those are super common in any marsh around here. Usually you only find 1 or 2 of them. A couple marshes, you'll find all 3. And then Heteranthia is these parallel veins. And what's unusual is it's got the stipule. So there's a stipule here. Stipule is the projection of the leaf. So here's the blade sheath, and then this kind of stick up from the sheath, stipule. Usually when you see stipule, you think of Potamogeton. We'll do that in just a minute. But there's also Heteranthia. But Heteranthia doesn't have a mid-vein. We'll do Potamogeton in just a second. All right, so that was Pontederiaceae. Next one, Typha or Typhaceae. Super easy because it's just Typha, right? And you guys should know your Typhas because it's everywhere, and you're doing this. So latifolia is easy because there's no separation between the male and female spikes. And then angustifolia, there's the separation, right? So Typhaceae, depending on some authors, super easy. Although they just added Sparganium, at least Michigan Flora did. So you also have to know Sparganium if you're going to do Typhaceae. Sparganium also have the really spongy, and they've got these little balls. Some people confuse that with carex because they kind of maybe look like a carex, but they're not, because they're just, it's a totally different. If you try to break that apart, it's totally different. That's the fruit. Lots of Sparganium, and then only the 2 Typha. And they're all obligate wetland plants. Okay, so here's just a better picture of your Typha, right? And then Sparganium. Next, Potamogeton ACA. If you guys have been in the water, you're probably kind of familiar with Potamogeton. Potamogeton, like, pull your hair out. because they're a pain to dissect or to key out. So if you're going to key them out, you having a dissecting scope really helps, because oftentimes you're asked to like count veins, which is hard to do, at least with my eyes. Sometimes I can hold them up to the light and see it just fine, but dissecting scope makes it really easy. I teach a class and I have people bring in their plants, and then we just get out the scopes, and it makes it really easy. Here's a fun one though. So Potamogeton, they're all aquatic. Okay, they're all submergents or floating. They've oftentimes, so this is your typical look for a floating leaf, and then so the same plant could have like a non-floating leaf that's kind of long and skinny. So they've got two different types of leaves sometimes, not every species. So that's these often different. The flower parts are in fours. If you go back to one of our first slides, that's like against the law, right, for a monocot. Remember, those were always sometimes, most of the times. So it's still a monocot, but it's fours. And then they've got the stipules. I'll show some pictures in a minute. And then that mid vein. Okay, lots of Potamogetons. I always like when I go fishing now, I spend more time identifying the weeds than pulling off the lure that catching fish some of the time. And my wife will ask, so what's that? And I just say, Potamogeton spa. Potamogeton spa. Spa for species. There's lots of them. They're all obligate wetland plants. So here's characteristics, good characteristics for Potamogeton. This gets you to Potamogeton spa. Then you're going to need a key to figure out what species. Again, the stipule, we mentioned the stipule just a minute ago when we did the heteranthia. So you can see the stipules here. Sometimes the stipules will kind of disintegrate, but usually they're pretty easy. And then there's a strong midvein. So if you got stipules and a midvein, it's a Potamogeton, period. Then if you got the different leaves that are the floating from the submerged, it's Potamogeton. Okay, so this is all Potamogeton. On the left here is Stachynia. Depending on what book you're looking at, they might have made that a new genus. Stachynia and Potamogeton more recently, and not always agreed on, separated genera. And the easy difference is the stipule. So here's the stipule here is stuck to the sheath. So like the sheath is more than 2/3 of it is not stipule. So like the stipule is tiny, whereas here the stipule is free. Or if it is attached, it's not attached to the leaf blade much. Okay, so then the blade comes off here. So the stipules adnate to the leaf blade more than 2/3. That makes it Stachynia. Or you can just remember it's Potamogeton and get out your key, right? There's only a couple Stachynias, so they're pretty easy to do. All right, those were your easy families, common easy monocots. Now I'm just gonna like super superficially do graminoids. And this is a little bit of false advertising because I said that I was going to do graminoids on Wednesday, but when I started putting stuff together over the weekend, I thought, nah, there's too many dicots. Even though they're not as common in the water, there's just a lot of families that are easy to go over characteristics. So graminoids. Graminae is the old name for the family. And so oid just means looks like, so these look grass-like. Okay. So technically they're your grasses, Poaceae, sedges, Cyperaceae, and rushes, Juncaceae. And they all look grass-like in appearance. What is grass-like? Long, skinny leaves. Okay. They've generally got a stolon or a runner or a rhizome. So stolon would just be above the ground or rhizome below. They don't have to, they could be individual, but most of them are. So most of your grasses are growing asexually, kind of through the ground. And they've got these long skinny leaves. Some things to look at that you might not have paid as much attention to is the ligule. You could say that's just a stipule, but because it's a grass and it's kind of a little different, we give it its own term. So ligule. So again, that's just the projection of the sheath, and it'd be behind this over here. You get ligule. Sometimes, like if I'm doing vegetation sampling, and so I've got a grid and there's just a bunch of grass, and I'm like, I don't know what grass this is. You can look around elsewhere to find an inflorescence and key it out, and then you key it out and you know what it is. But so like your plot doesn't have any inflorescence, so you're struggling, right? You can actually look, and sometimes these ligules are quite distinct. So if you go find, usually in an area there's only, well, there could be 5 to 10 grasses, but oftentimes there's mostly just a couple. So if you go find an inflorescence, then look at the inflorescence, figure out what it is. Look at the ligule of it, go back to your little areas. Sometimes you can figure it out just based off of that. Sometimes the way the sheath wraps around can be a little unique too. So you don't have to have an inflorescence. You have to have an inflorescence to key it out. But if you're in a plot where you're just doing vegetation sampling that doesn't have an inflorescence, you might be able to get away with these two structures. All right, that was grass-like graminoid. So now we're just going to do Juncaceae. Juncaceae is super simple. They're lily-like. So I got a picture of a lily, right? We know that is this a petal or a sepal? Petal, right? Because 3 petals here. And then you can see here that those are sepals, right? They look the same, so you could say 6 sepals. So here's a really pretty juncus. And it's got the 6 sepals, right? It's got the 6 stamen, okay? And it's got the pistil has 3 parts to it. And you can really see it in this picture, right? So it's just a little tiny lily, right? It's a little, so it's both grass-like and lily-like. So that's Juncaceae for a rush. That's it, really. So they're just little, they're cute. You hardly ever see these in flower because they only flower for a few days out of the year. I mean, the flowers don't last super long. If you're later in the season, though, you'll see the capsule. And then the capsule, if you look at the capsule from the top, you'll have well, let me do a different picture. It can have 3 parts, and then you have the 6 sepals. So sometimes people will think that there's 9 sepals, but there aren't, because it's the capsule. And then the seeds are tiny. So each one of those, so it'll have these little tiny seeds. Juncaceae, really simple. They're just little. So if you got a little lens, it makes it easier. 30 of the 37 species are wetland plants. So they're a good one to know for aquatic. That's it for Juncaceae. Juncaceae, there is also Lucilla, but Lucilla is easy. So there's only 2 genera here. I should have put a picture. This actually is a Lucilla, but you can't tell from this. If you looked at the leaves, they just do a leaf. They have little tiny hairs on the leaf margin, whereas Juncus doesn't. So that's Lucilla. It has little hairs. There's only the 2 genera, so it makes it easy. And Lucilla is pretty rare, so almost all of them are Juncus. Then Cyperaceae. So Cyperaceae, now we're getting really specialized. So if you think kind of the evolutionary ladder, if you will, people think of the more specialized as more evolved. It's not really true. Bacteria are just as evolved as people, but they're more specialized, right? So oftentimes people think of for the monocots is like the most specialized is the orchids, which is true, they're pretty specialized, but the grasses are even more specialized. And Cyperaceae are kind of on the way towards that. And they are, the Juncaceae, Cyperaceae, and Poaceae are closely related. So Cyperaceae have one protective scale protects each flower / fruit. So this is one of those scales. And then you can see underneath here, we've got the stamen sticking out, and then we've got the stigma style, in the stigma here in the style, that's part of the pistil. So you only see the top of it. Okay, so you got the anther and the filament, and then just the little tip of the stigma, maybe a little style here. And so each one of these flowers is protected by a scale. If you pulled this back, then there'd be an achene underneath here, once it matures. Okay, the fruit is an achene. Achenes would be like sunflower seeds. So you could technically open it up and get the seed from the center. Okay, I really like the sedges, and you really need to know the sedges because they're super common and aquatic. The saying that a lot of people do is, if it's got, well, a lot of people say sedges have edges. No, not all of them do. So I like this better. If it's got an edge, it's most likely it's edge, right? So here's a nice triangular one, triangular stem. If you got a triangular stem, it's probably a sedge. But mints have square stems, so it's not any edge. But if you look, 184 of the 272 species are wetland plants. And they're going to be the dominant plants in most of your wet areas. So knowing the sedges is super important. I was, tempted to do just all the genera of the sedges, but it would take too long. So if you're doing sedges, what you really have to look for is a spikelet. So spikelet is just a little tiny spike. So remember, a spike is when all the flowers are directly on the stem. So there's a stem here, and then there's lots of little flowers. So like this spikelet here has probably got, I don't know, 50 to 100 flowers there. And maybe half of those will then produce seeds or fruit. Seed / fruit, because it's just a one-seeded fruit. So when you do sedges, you have to know what a spikelet is. So I've just circled some different spikelets, right? So like there's a ton of them right here. So spikelet, 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 right? You get the idea. Each one of these little cone-like things is its own spikelet. Within the sedges is carex. Carex is there's more species of carex than any other plant on the planet. So it's great. You can sound really smart and you say, that's a carex. It's kind of like saying Potomac Eaton spa. It's kind of worthless, but because there's so many of them, but you sound smart. So we've got a periginium. So there's this sac-like thing. The scales are usually a little bit reduced because, so here, this is the scale. Here's a scale. It's got this big sac thing. You open up the sac, and then there's the achene, the fruit, the pistil. So it's got this unique structure, the periginium or perigynum. It's the female part, so you can say gynum. Periginium is what most people say, but you can say perigynum. Doesn't matter. If you've got the periginium, the only time that term is ever used is with carex. So you might as well just say is carex. Another thing, they'll have male and female flowers. Oftentimes there'll be different spikelets, but they don't have to be. You could have half of it one and half the other. This one's kind of male on top and female on bottom. Sometimes there'll be the female on top, but that's pretty rare. Usually it's the male on top because it's getting, dispersing the pollen in the wind. So here's just another fun picture of a carex. There's tons and tons and tons of species of carex. All right, so now we're to our last family for our monocots, the most specialized Poaceae. 66 of the 270 species are wetland plants. Okay. I didn't show all the lists because it's just way too big for the graminoids. Again, if you're doing wetland plants, it's a great way to start into botany because it's you can learn. 66 is a lot, but of those, there's probably 20 that are, or less than that, there's about 10 that are super common. So like for my class that I teach, I forget the number now, but I teach less than 20 grasses. They're like the most common ones that are in almost every wetland. They're doable. That is daunting. This is not as daunting, and the common ones are even less daunting. So knowing your wetland grasses really isn't as bad as it seems because there's just fewer of them to choose from. Having fewer of them to choose from makes it easier. Problem is the keys are always based on this, not the smaller. So that, but once you get an eye for them. So you need to know all the parts, and it's got all these different terms. So the main thing though is there's two scales now that protect every flower. The pala, the A's cut off here, so there's an A at the end of this. B-A-L-E-A. And lemma. The lemma is always bigger. Okay, so the lemma by definition is the bigger one. Pala is the smaller one. So you got the big one, the smaller one. Open that up, and then there's the fruit or caryopsis or grain on the inside. Okay, so lemma, pala. Sometimes the pala is kind of like if it's a sterile one, it can be inside, so it makes it just look like there's one scale, but there's always two scales, protects every flower. We don't call it flowers anymore, we call it florets. The floret technically includes the lemma and pala. Okay, so here's some better pictures. Another easy thing for grasses, they're always in one plane. So leaf, so leaf. Sedges come out in threes. So rushes also come out in threes. So if it's all in one plane, then it's a grass. Also, the inflorescence is going to be in one plane. They'll come out, it might be fat, but it's, they're coming out here, right? So this is one floret. So what would this be called? Because it's the smaller one, that's with a B, pala. The bigger one, lemma. Okay, so here, lemma, bigger, pala, smaller. Then there's the female parts, the pistil, male part, filament, okay, stamen, filament, anther, right? So those are all inside. So this whole thing is the floret. In this little picture here, it's a one floreted spikelet. I'm not going to fit that spikelet. Whereas over here, it's a multi-floreted spikelet. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 florets per spikelet. This is kind of your ornamental oat. It's a great one to learn on because it's just the seeds are bigger and it's easier. Every spikelet is subtended by two glooms. Okay, so glooms. So here there's a gloom and a gloom. Oops. Gloom. I wish I had a different color here. So gloom. So every spikelet is subtended by two glooms. Every flower is subtended by two scales, lemma and pala. Subtended just means at the bottom. So it's easier in a sense to tell what a spikelet is for grasses because there's always those two glooms at the base. Just a fun thing, if you're kind of into farming or kind of, remember your grasses are the most important family for people. because it's most of the calories are like corn, or maize, rice, oats, wheat, but the three big ones, wheat, corn, or maize, and rice feed basically, that's like 90% of the caloric consumption of most of the planet. So, and those are all grains, and those store, and because of that, a lot of people attribute the domestication of grasses as kind of the foundation for civilization. When you're eating, so to get those grains, you have to remove all these scales, and they don't say scales or lemon, pala, and glooms. They just say chaff. Kind of fun. So you'd never eat the chaff. All right, so I just got a couple of fun pictures of some grasses. Keep it simple. There's always a lemon, pala, and there's always two glooms. There's a couple exceptions, but almost always. So look at a couple grasses. Don't be intimidated. Just look for those couple structures. If you get an eye for seeing those couple structures, first off, you know it's a grass or Poaceae. And then you can get out a key and get a cup of coffee or a glass of tea and just chill out, because it's going to take a while to key it out. There's a lot of terms. You're probably going to want a book full of terms just to look up as you're keying it. They're not horrible, but it's daunting because they're small, so you want to dissect in scope. But you're just going to see these same terms over and over, these same structures. So here's just a couple of fun, easy ones to make you feel good about a grass. So again, the bigger lemma, smaller pala. Okay, this one, the florets are really separated out, so the glooms are at the base. Okay, simple. And then this is your wheat. So we've broken off the pala here, so that's been removed. So we've got the grain here. There's the lemma, and then there's two glooms at the base. Okay, that's it. They're really simple. At least the ones I'm showing you are really simple. There's some specialized ones that make you pull your hair out. What I always do is start out with ones that I already know, and then learn the terms for the ones that you already know. Because once you already know them, you can look up a description of all the parts, and then use that description to kind of feel good about learning the parts. So here's your graminoids again, just a quick summary. Juncus, rushes, Juncaceae, really simple. It's just 6 sepals. They're just little lilies. Cyperaceae has got a scale protecting every flower, just one scale. And then Poaceae has 2 scales, the bigger one, lemma, smaller one, pala. And then there's 2 glooms that protect every spike. Okay, and that's it. Monocots, Gymnosperms, and Ferns in an hour and 20 minutes. I don't want to read this, but I give this to you just as a fun summary. Okay, so I'm happy to take questions. Let me hit stop here.
Yeah, well, wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Hollister. If there are any questions out there, please type them quickly using that Q&A chat function, and we can ask them out loud. Otherwise, if you don't have any questions, you're free to go. We'll stick around here for maybe a minute or two just to see if any questions pour in.
I love all the emojis.
Yeah, it's very nice. Everybody's probably just trying to piece together all of this information.
But the nice thing is I gave you those handouts. I should have also pointed out that there's the quick description of all the common plants. That's what I put together for my course. And those also have just a quick summary for each of the families. It's kind of fun.
Okay. Well, we have
tell my students to take this lecture, is going to be overwhelming, but then once you're out, usually we're going to places and we're looking at stuff. So we go over the same thing over and over. It's easier when you're looking at plants to do it. But having this as kind of a first, and then go out and look at, and then come back to this, and then go out and look and then come back to this is a good approach.
Sure. Oh, we have a comment, not a question. Somebody says, great overview. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay. Again, type your questions if you have any. We'll get them answered. Okay, so I don't see any questions popping up here. So thank you, Dr. Hollister, for a lovely presentation. And we look forward to part 2 on Wednesday at 3 p.m. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And if you haven't registered for part 2 yet, go to MWA's website, find part 2, and register using that separate link. And thank you very much and have a great rest of your day. It's going to be nice weather all week, so enjoy it. All right. Thank you, Dr. Hollister. We'll see you Wednesday.
All right.
Thank you. Bye.